The highway had thinned to a whisper of asphalt, then to a gravel track that clawed its way through ancient stoic pines. My determination, a brittle shield against the encroaching gloom, felt less substantial with every mile. Hours ago, I had paused in a foggy parking garage where footsteps echoed too long, the cavernous space amplifying each scuff of my boots, each breath a plume against the chilled air. That momentary stop, meant to gather my thoughts before the final leg, had instead imbued the journey with a premonition of quiet unease, a sense of being observed even in solitude. Now the road vanished entirely, replaced by a winding drive choked with overgrowth. It was here, at the edge of the world, that the estate finally revealed itself. Hope, that fragile blossom I had nurtured through the arduous journey, shivered and threatened to retract. A wrought iron gate, rusted into immobility, barred the main entrance. I wrestled with its stubborn latch, the cold metal biting into my gloved hand, until with a groan that seemed to emanate from the very earth, it swung inward. I cut the ignition, and the sudden cessation of sound was a physical blow. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air, heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves, held a subtle, deeper note, a musty, ferrous aroma, like forgotten blood or ancient rust. Above me, the mansion loomed, its sheer scale overwhelming. Stone gargoyles, their faces worn smooth by countless seasons, peered down from high buttresses, their silent vigil unsettling. My hand, steady despite the tremor in my chest, pushed open the massive door. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a grand foyer of astonishing proportions. A sweeping staircase, its balustrade intricately carved with intertwining serpents and faceless figures, ascended into the blackness above. It was a space designed not for comfort, but for grandeur, for intimidation, perhaps even for ritual. I moved slowly, each sound I made reverberating through the cavernous space, as if the house itself were listening. I ventured deeper, my beam sweeping across vast, silent rooms. A library, its shelves groaning under the weight of countless forgotten volumes. A dining hall, its immense table shrouded in a ghostly white sheet, chairs arranged in an unsettlingly formal circle. Everywhere the architecture was elaborate, almost excessive, filled with strange niches and unexpected alcoves, some seemingly too small to serve any practical purpose. The layout felt less like a home and more like a puzzle, a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient. In what appeared to be a study, tucked away behind a heavy velvet-draped archway, I found it. The room was smaller than the others, its walls lined with built-in shelves that held an assortment of tarnished silver, brittle scrolls, and the occasional, unsettlingly lifelike ceramic figurine. But it was the fireplace that drew my eye. Or rather, what was built into the wall beside it. My fingers traced the rough wood, finding a faint seam. With a gentle pull, it swung inward, not a door, but a panel. Inside, nestled in a bed of desiccated velvet, lay a single object. It was a heavy, ornate iron box, no larger than my hand, its surface blackened with age and intricate, almost indecipherable carvings. A faint, cloying scent, like dried herbs and something metallic, emanated from within the recess. I hesitated, my fingers hovering above the cold metal. The air around the box felt inexplicably dense, charged with a palpable tension. This was no ordinary family heirloom. It was aware, and it had been waiting for me. Now the gravel crunched beneath my tires, a lonely, defiant sound in the deepening twilight. The estate emerged from the tree line like a forgotten titan, its silhouette jagged against a bruised sky. Gargoyles, weathered by centuries, leered from cornices, their stone eyes fixed on a distant, unseen horror. The iron gates, rusted to a deep, blood-red hue, groaned open with a reluctant shriek as I pushed them. Stepping inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else. A faint metallic tang I couldn't place. The vast entrance hall swallowed my voice, my footsteps, even the hum of my own thoughts. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and attempting to impose order on the chaos of generations. I wiped down mahogany surfaces, swept away cobwebs thick as shrouds, and tried to coax life back into the dormant fireplaces. It was during these quiet, solitary tasks that the edges of reality began to fray. I was in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes, their pages brittle with age. I'd been cataloging the collection, noting the strange, archaic titles, when a flicker caught my eye. It was gone before I could fully turn, leaving only the impression of a fleeting, formless blur. My mind, quick to rationalize, attributed it to fatigue, or perhaps a trick of the light in the dusty room. An old house, I told myself, had its own peculiar optics. It wasn't a distinct word, merely a breathy murmur, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor or the rustle of ancient parchment. I paused, straining my ears, but the sound dissolved into the general creaking and groaning of the old structure. Just the house settling, I decided, a chorus of ancient timbers adjusting to the shift in temperature. Nothing more. My determination, though chipped, remained intact. This was my fresh start, and I wouldn't let an overactive imagination spoil it. But the subtle manifestations continued, like persistent insects buzzing at the edge of hearing. I would leave a book neatly closed on a table, only to return an hour later to find its spine slightly ajar. A single page dog-eared. A heavy brass letter opener, which I had placed precisely parallel to the edge of a writing desk, would be found angled, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I'd checked the windows, the doors, convinced I must have left something open, but all remained securely latched. Each time I'd sigh, dismiss it as my own absent-mindedness, the quirks of an unfamiliar environment. Perhaps the house had a slight tilt, causing objects to shift. One night, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it the wind. It felt organic, like a subterranean pulse. I froze, my hand on the banister of the sweeping staircase, listening. My breath hitched in my throat. I told myself it was the old plumbing, perhaps a distant train, though I knew no tracks ran close to the estate. My knife clattered to the floor. I spun around, my heart thrumming against my ribs, but the pantry was empty, its shelves laden with dusty, forgotten jars. The house, which I had hoped would be a sanctuary, now felt like a vast, silent watcher. I started to find myself checking locks more often, glancing over my shoulder in empty rooms, my ears straining for the slightest aberration in the pervasive quiet. I was no longer merely alone. I was, I suspected, in the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting. That place, a brief liminal purgatory, had etched itself into my memory with its damp chill and the unnerving way the air seemed to hold its breath. The initial unease, a subtle prickle at the nape of my neck, had sharpened into an undeniable presence. It began with the trivial, the easily dismissed. A door, which I swore I had latched, would stand ajar, a dark mouth exhaling cold air into the hallway. These were pinpricks, easily rationalized away as forgetfulness or the subtle shifts of an old house settling. But the house was not settling, it was stirring. One evening, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, painting the tall windows in bruised purples, I was in the library, attempting to lose myself in a faded tome on ancient architecture. The air, already thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, suddenly grew heavy, like a shroud descending. Then, the sound. A sharp, violent thud from the floor above, as if a heavy object had been flung against a wall. My head snapped up, heart stuttering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stood, a tremor in my hands, and walked slowly to the library door, peering into the cavernous hall. Nothing. Later that week, the auditory assaults escalated. Sleep became a fractured mosaic of half-dreams and sudden awakenings. Not words, not quite, but the ghost of human articulation, a dry rustle of sound, like dead leaves skittering across a vast, empty room. Sometimes, a door would slam with an explosive force that rattled the very foundations, echoing through the silent halls like a gunshot. I would rush to investigate, but always found the door securely shut, as if the sound had been merely a phantom limb of the house, lashing out. These were pockets of absolute frigidity, sudden and localized, that would manifest in the warmest parts of the mansion. I would be walking through the sun-drenched conservatory, feeling the pleasant warmth on my skin, when suddenly, a patch of air before me would plummet in temperature like stepping into a freezer. The hair on my arms would stand on end, a primal response to an unnatural anomaly. It was a tangible touch, an invisible hand reaching out from the unseen. I could no longer deny it. The house was not merely old, it was inhabited, and whatever dwelled within its walls was making its presence known with an escalating malevolent intent. My determination, once a brittle shield, had become a desperate resolve. I had come seeking a fresh start, a quiet inheritance, not a haunting. The time for rationalization was over. The time for understanding had begun. I retreated to the mansion's dusty, disused study, a room rarely touched by the sun, where tall, leaded windows looked out onto a forgotten garden. Here, among the detritus of generations past, I began my excavation. Piles of leather-bound ledgers, brittle journals, and bundles of yellowed correspondence became my battlefield. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom like tiny, frantic spirits. My fingers, stained with the grime of ages, traced faded script, deciphering the looping hand of ancestors long turned to dust. The language of their lives unfolded before me, a tapestry of mundane accounts interwoven with cryptic threads. I found references to the family's burden, the necessity of the right, and the binding of the bloodline. One particularly disturbing entry. No names attached to these more sinister remarks, only the stark, unsettling phrasing that hinted at something ancient and terrible. A recurring symbol, a jagged, almost runic mark, appeared etched into the margins of an old property deed, then again on a weathered map of the estate, marking a specific, isolated section of the grounds. It pulsed with a silent significance, drawing my eye, demanding interpretation. The question was no longer if something was here, but what it was, and what precisely it intended for me. The memory of that echoing silence, broken only by the distant, disembodied scuff of soles on concrete, still pricked at the edges of my thoughts, a premonition of loneliness deeper than any I had known. Now the mansion's silhouette, jagged against a sky-bruised purple, loomed. Each window, a vacant eye, seemed to watch my approach. I could feel the house, a vast, slumbering beast, stirring with my presence, acknowledging my return. The air inside the car, despite the warmth of the day's fading sun, had grown strangely frigid. I pushed open the heavy oak door, its groan a familiar lament. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the tall, grimy windows, each particle a tiny, fleeting spirit in the vast, still air. The scent of old wood, damp stone, and something metallic, like forgotten blood, hung heavy. There was something here, something that followed, something that watched. My gaze drifted to the great carved fireplace in the study, a focal point of the room. It had always drawn me, an ancient, brooding presence. Tonight, a subtle shift caught my eye. It was too regular, too deliberate to be natural erosion or stain. Driven by a sudden, undeniable instinct, I dragged a heavy armchair over, its velvet fabric releasing a puff of stale air and dust. I climbed onto it, my fingers tracing the outline of the anomaly. My fingers found a hairline seam, almost invisible, running along the discolored patch. It wasn't a crack. It was a join. With renewed determination, I pressed, pushed, ran my fingertips along the edges, feeling for a catch, a release. The gargoyle's stony eyes seemed to bore into me, its carved maw twisted in a permanent, silent snarl. Then, a faint click. It was barely audible, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the room. But I felt it, a subtle give beneath my touch. My breath hitched. The air that wafted from the newly revealed space was thick, laden with the scent of extreme age, decay, and something else. Something sharp and acrid, like old fear. I pulled it out carefully. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and flaking, bound with tarnished brass clasps. The pages, yellowed and fragile, were filled with a spidery, precise script, written in ink that had faded to sepia. The first few entries were mundane, chronicling weather and minor estate matters. But then the tone shifted, growing increasingly agitated, the handwriting beginning to slant erratically. My eyes scanned the brittle pages, skipping past the initial banalities, seeking the truth I knew lay hidden within. The family's burden, a shadow cast across generations. My great-uncle, they called him mad, but I see the truth in his wild eyes now. The pact, sealed in blood, demands its due. The house feeds, not on stone or timber, but on something far more precious. The ritual must be maintained, or the hunger will consume us all. The words pulsed before my eyes, each syllable a claw scraping at the thin veneer of my sanity. The pact, the ritual, the vessel. My ancestors' descent wasn't madness. It was a desperate, terrifying attempt to record a horrifying reality. The house wasn't merely haunted. It was a trap, a living maw demanding sustenance. And I, Cole, the latest inheritor, had walked right into it. The words, burned into my vision from the journal's brittle page, continued their slow, agonizing rotation behind my eyelids. The pact, the ritual, the vessel. They had not faded with the light of the setting sun, nor had they dissipated with the rising chill that now permeated every stone of the sprawling estate. The air, once merely old, now felt thick, a viscous medium through which sound struggled and light seemed to warp. I stood in the study, the journal still clutched in my hand, but my gaze was fixed on the deepening shadows that gathered in the room's corners, coiling like unseen serpents. The house, which had merely felt watchful before, now pulsed with a focused malevolence. The subtle creaks and groans of settling timber, once dismissed as the natural respiration of an ancient structure, now sounded deliberate, a slow, methodical approach. It was a promise of proximity, an assurance that I was not alone, and never would be again. Sleep, when it finally claimed me hours later, was not a release, but a deeper descent. My mind, already frayed, offered no sanctuary. I found myself adrift in a landscape of shifting gray, a place where the air tasted of wet earth and ancient iron. It beckoned with a hand that seemed to stretch and contract, its fingers too long, too numerous. I felt a pull, an inexorable drawing toward this silent, hungry specter. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, its walls closing in, the foundations rumbling with a low, guttural hum that vibrated in my teeth. The figure raised its elongated arm, pointing not at me, but into me, and with a terrible clarity I understood. The vessel was not a place, but a receptacle, a skin to be worn, a mind to be subsumed. I woke with a gasp, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead, the phantom hum still resonating deep within my bones. The house felt smaller, the walls less protective, more like the shell of a creature that had just swallowed me whole. The antique clock in the hallway, which had been silent since my arrival, began to chime. its metallic rings strangely distorted, dragging on for far too long, each toll a hammer blow against my skull. Then, a framed photograph of my great-grandfather, which had always hung perfectly level on the living room wall, suddenly tilted, then fell with a soft, muffled thud onto the thick rug, its glass intact, its gaze accusatory. This was no longer a haunting, it was a siege. The entity was not merely present, it was actively reaching, prodding, demanding. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered under the relentless assault. I could not stay. This place was a trap, and I, the bait. With a desperate resolve, I began to gather my things. A small bag, some clothes, the journal. I couldn't leave that. I drove my car out of the main gates, the gravel crunching under the tires like breaking bones, and headed for the outskirts of town. My destination, a small, impersonal motel. The relief, however, was fleeting. As I approached the turnoff, a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in, not from the nearby river or marshland, but from the ground itself, rising in spectral tendrils that coiled around my headlights. The fog swallowed the road, then the surrounding trees, and finally, my sense of direction. The air here was damp and heavy, tasting of concrete and unseen moisture. The ceiling dripped with an irregular cadence, each drop echoing with an unnatural resonance. I tried the ignition again, but the engine only coughed weakly, a dying breath. My phone, which had a full charge moments before, was now a dead slab of plastic and metal. Panic clawed at my throat. I tried the car door, but it was locked, the central locking system unresponsive. I was trapped, not by a physical barrier, but by an unseen force that pressed down on the vehicle, on me, with crushing intensity. The echoing footsteps I heard were not my own, but multiple overlapping sounds, some heavy, some light, some dragging, all moving just beyond the veil of the fog surrounding my car. They were too close, too numerous, too impossible. It was deep, ancient, and utterly devoid of mercy. You are the vessel, Cole. You cannot leave. The ritual demands completion. A profound, binding compulsion settled over me, a weight heavier than any physical chain. It was not merely a suggestion, but an absolute command, sinking into the marrow of my bones. I felt an invisible hand on the steering wheel, turning it, guiding the car. The engine sputtered to life, not at my command, but at its will. Slowly, inexorably, the car reversed, then turned, driving itself back through the impenetrable fog, back towards the sprawling, malevolent house. The entity wasn't just haunting me, it was controlling me. The engine died with a shuddering sigh, a breath held too long, then exhaled into the damp, cold air. I sat for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, knuckles white, the phantom pressure of an invisible hand lingering. It had guided me here, to this place, this forgotten pocket of the city. Wisps of gray vapor clung to the low ceiling, obscuring the flickering fluorescent tubes, making each pale beam a lonely island in the gloom. I killed the headlights, plunging the car's interior into near-total darkness, save for the faint glow of the dashboard. Overwhelmed, yes, but not broken. I needed answers, a tether to reality, even if that reality was far more twisted than I could have imagined. Who would believe me? A local historian, perhaps, someone who sifted through the dust of forgotten lore, or an expert in the obscure, a scholar of the unseen. I had made a call, a desperate plea whispered into the receiver, and now I waited. Each inhale was shallow, each exhale a tremor. I listened, the drip of condensation somewhere in the concrete labyrinth, the distant, distorted rumble of city traffic, a sound that felt miles away, belonging to a different world. And then, the faint, scuffing drag of a shoe drawing closer, too slow, too deliberate. My eyes strained against the gloom, searching the veiled spaces between the concrete pillars. The sound grew, then stopped. A car door groaned open, then thudded shut. A figure emerged from the swirling mists, a silhouette against the faint glow of a distant exit sign. It was an older man, bundled in a thick, unassuming coat, a worn leather satchel clutched in one hand. He moved with a careful, almost hesitant gait, his gaze sweeping the empty bays. The historian flinched, then approached, his face etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, held a weariness that suggested he had seen more than just dusty archives. "Cole?" His voice was a low murmur, barely audible over the echoing emptiness. "Yes," I replied, the word feeling inadequate. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, not speaking, but gesturing for me to follow. I spoke of the binding compulsion, the way it had led me here. His expression remained neutral, yet his eyes sharpened with each detail. "My family," I pressed. "There's something, a secret. Not all history is written in books. Some is etched in blood, in the very stones of a place. Your ancestor, a man named Elias Thorne, sought power. He delved into practices best left untouched. He performed a ritual, not to summon. He believed he could harness it, make it serve his will, imbue his bloodline with its power. But he miscalculated. The binding was imperfect, a cage with rusted bars. It did not serve him. It merely festered, growing stronger with each generation, leeching vitality from your ancestors, waiting for the moment of its full release." My breath caught. "Release? What does it want?" "A vessel," he uttered, the word hanging heavy in the air. "A pure conduit from the bloodline that first disturbed it. A body to anchor its full manifestation, to walk the world again, unhindered. The house is its prison, its anchor. And now, with the passage of time, the thinning of the veil, and your return, it seeks its completion." The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a haunting, it was an inheritance, a living, breathing curse passed down through generations. I was not just a victim, I was the intended prize. "There must be a way," I choked out, my voice raw. "A counter-ritual?" The historian nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine, filled with a grim understanding. "Yes, a reversal, a true sealing. But it is not a simple incantation, Cole. It demands a specific confluence, a particular astronomical alignment, a precise location within the mansion, and a sacrifice of significant personal energy. It requires one of the bloodline to perform it, to face the entity directly, to offer themselves, not as a vessel, but as a lock, to willingly bind it once more, perhaps even permanently, but at a cost. My bloodline had started this, and now my bloodline was expected to end it. The cost. What kind of sacrifice? My life? My sanity? The fog seemed to swirl with a purpose, eddying around the pillars, thickening the air. The faint, echoing drip of water seemed to quicken, a frantic pulse in the concrete. I felt a tightening in my chest, a prickle on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching us, listening to every word. The entity knew. It knew I was seeking answers. It will try to break you, to prepare you for its arrival. It will offer power, false promises. You must understand the gravity of this. You are not simply fighting a ghost. You are fighting a legacy. He pressed a small, leather-bound journal into my hand, its pages brittle with age. This contains some of what I've found. Dates, symbols, a fragment of the counter-ritual. I gripped it tight, my gaze darting into the swirling fog. The echoes of footsteps, which had been mine, now seemed to multiply, fading and reappearing from unseen corners. Too many, too close. I had sought answers, and I had found them. The journal felt heavy, Cold, a burden now irrevocably mine. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound recognition, traced its way up my spine. I had come to meet the historian, to share the grim harvest of my recent discoveries, to forge a weapon from knowledge. But the air itself seemed to resist, to press against my skin with an unseen force. From the swirling gray, a shape coalesced, a deep structural complaint, as if the very foundations of the garage were shifting, settling into an unnatural repose. Then the sounds began in earnest. It was a symphony of unease, orchestrated by an invisible hand. A section of the ceiling, a heavy chunk of concrete, detached itself with a sickening tear, plummeting to the ground where moments before I had stood. Dust exploded upwards, mingling with the fog, creating a choking cloud. This was no mere echo. This was malice given form. "We need to go," I urged, my voice hoarse, pulling at the historian's arm. They stumbled, their gaze fixed on the journal in my hand. Their eyes, wide and unnervingly bright in the gloom, seemed to see beyond the leather and paper into the very essence of the evil it contained. As I tugged, a series of sharp percussive blows erupted around us. Not against us, but against the parked cars nearby. Denting metal, shattering glass. The piercing shriek of car alarms tore through the air, a cacophony of digital screams that grated on my nerves, making every muscle tense, ready to spring or cower. I could feel a pressure building, like a hand pressed against my chest, invisible but undeniably present, pushing me back, seeking to pin me. I fought against it, my feet scrabbling for purchase on the damp ground. I would not let go. This was retaliation. The entity, whatever spectral horror it was, had felt my intent, my nascent defiance, and was striking back with a brutal, visceral force. It wasn't just trying to scare me. It was trying to dismantle my resolve, to isolate me, to prevent me from using the very tool I held. Suddenly, a massive shudder ran through the entire structure. A concrete pillar, thick and formidable, began to crack, spiderwebbing lines appearing across its surface. The historian, caught off balance, stumbled backwards, their head striking a lower section of the pillar with a sickening thud. They crumpled, their satchel flying from their grasp, spilling its contents. Old scrolls, faded maps, a small, ornate silver box. Across the grimy floor. "No!" I shouted, the word torn from my throat. I lunged towards them, but a sudden invisible force slammed into my side, sending me sprawling. My head hit the concrete with a jarring impact, stars exploding behind my eyes. The journal flew from my grasp, skittering across the floor, coming to rest near the historian's outstretched, unmoving hand. Dazed, my vision swimming, I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest. The alarms continued their banshee wail. The fog, thick and cloying, seemed to writhe, taking on ephemeral shapes at the periphery of my sight. As I reached them, a single flickering fluorescent tube above us sputtered back to life, casting a harsh, intermittent glow. In that fractured light, I saw the historian's face, pale and still, a thin trickle of blood blooming against their temple. Their eyes were open, unfocused, staring blankly at the ceiling. And then, I saw it. One of the historian's fallen scrolls, a brittle, parchment-thin sheet, had unfurled itself in the chaotic wind. It depicted a complex geometric pattern, a ritual circle, and at its center, a symbol I now recognized from the deeper recesses of my family's lore. A twisted, thorny vine coiling around a skeletal hand. The entity wasn't just defending itself. It was preparing. And the sacrifice, I realized with a fresh wave of horror, might not be mine alone. The air grew heavy, pregnant with expectation, as if the very space around us held its breath, waiting for the next inevitable act. The air, indeed, had grown thick, a suffocating blanket woven from dread and expectation. The entity, I understood now with a chilling clarity that settled deep within my bones, was not merely reacting. It was preparing. And I, Cole, was its unwilling participant, perhaps even its intended vessel. The revelation had stripped away the last vestiges of denial, leaving only a stark, terrifying truth. I had to descend, not into madness, but into the very heart of the estate's curse. The basement, I knew, was merely a threshold. The true nexus lay deeper, hidden, a place where generations of my ancestors had unknowingly nurtured the horror that now sought to claim me. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards as I made my way to the hidden passage I'd finally uncovered, a cleverly disguised section of the old cellar wall. With a grunt, I forced open the crumbling stone, revealing a narrow, descending tunnel. It was not the pristine, organized basement of a well-kept home, but a raw, uncarved maw leading into the earth. The entity, sensing my intent, began its full assault. You are its chosen. Your blood sings its song. Give yourself, Cole. Eventually, the crude stone gave way to a more structured yet equally decaying environment. This was not the ancient altar I had envisioned, but something far more unsettling. The sheer incongruity of it was a shock. How could such a modern structure exist beneath the centuries-old mansion? The air here was thick with a cloying chemical scent mixed with the pervasive dampness. Rusting vehicles, skeletal hulks of forgotten cars, stood like silent sentinels in the swirling mist, their forms barely discernible. My footsteps, usually muffled, now rang out with an exaggerated clarity, each sound bouncing off unseen walls, multiplying, confusing my sense of direction. The entity loved this place. It was a labyrinth of disuse and decay, a perfect stage for its illusions. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but saw nothing but the swirling fog. Then, a vehicle horn blared, a short, sharp burst that made me flinch, though no car was close enough and no one else was here. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disorienting assault on my senses. I stumbled, feeling a sudden, invisible shove that sent me careening into the side of a rusted sedan. Its cold metal grated against my arm, leaving a stinging scratch. This was no longer just psychological torment. It was a physical manifestation of its rage. It was me, but not me. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head, forcing the image away. Not me, never me. I pressed on, my resolve hardening with each step, fueled by a potent mix of fear and defiance. It was an area where the fog seemed thicker, almost coalescing into solid shapes. It was the door the key belonged to. As I reached for the handle, a violent tremor shook the entire garage. A heavy, unseen force slammed into my chest, knocking the air from my lungs, throwing me backward. Pain flared, but I barely registered it. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard it. A low, keening wail that filled the garage, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The entity was fighting back with everything it had. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, my eyes still fixed on the faintly glowing door, I saw something else. It was a complex interlocking pattern I recognized from one of the old texts. A protection sigil meant to bind or to repel. And beneath it, a single faded word carved into the wood. Sanctum. This was not merely a door. It was a barrier, a shield. And behind it, I realized, lay not just the ultimate ritual site, but perhaps the very source of its weakness. The counter-ritual, the binding I sought, was within reach. I would be its end. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, the moisture thick in my lungs. The iron key, clutched tight in my palm, thrummed with a low, insistent pulse. A living thing guiding me deeper into the pallid whiteout. My own footsteps, strangely amplified, seemed to stretch into the distance. A ghostly procession following me through the suffocating mist. The fog here was not a natural phenomenon. It tasted of decay and old iron. a metallic tang that coated my tongue. It swirled, denser than elsewhere, congealing into vague, shifting forms at the periphery of my vision. I pressed on, my coat brushing against unseen pillars, the rough concrete walls a chilling presence beside me. The key's pull grew stronger, tugging me towards a section where the mist was almost opaque, a solid wall of spectral gray. It was there, half hidden behind a hulking, moss-stained pillar, that I found it. A low archway, barely taller than myself, cut into the rock of the garage's furthest wall. It wasn't a door, but a maw, an opening into absolute blackness that seemed to drink the meager ambient light. The key vibrated violently, a frantic heartbeat against my flesh. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated from within the arch, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull, a low, ancient thrum. I stepped through, the air immediately colder, heavier, saturated with an unbearable dread. The arch opened into a small, circular chamber, carved crudely from the earth. No light penetrated this space. The key, however, began to glow, a faint, sickly green luminescence that pulsed with the same rhythm now echoing in my chest. The chamber was bare, save for a single rough-hewn stone altar in its center. Upon its surface, etched deep into the rock, was a complex, sprawling symbol, one I vaguely recognized from the house's cryptic texts. As my eyes adjusted to the key's faint glow, I saw it, a small, circular indentation at the symbol's heart. My fingers trembled as I raised the key, its unique head fitting perfectly into the depression. The moment the iron touched the stone, a guttural moan ripped through the chamber, not from a throat, but from the very air itself. The green glow intensified, engulfing the altar, then rushing outwards, illuminating the walls. My breath hitched. This was it. The source, the origin. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. It was a deluge, a psychic assault meant to break me. You sought this, Cole. You sought the truth. The voice was a discordant chorus, 1,000 voices speaking as one, yet none spoke aloud. It was in my head, a violation. I clutched the key, my knuckles white. I came to end it, I grated, my own voice a pathetic croak against the mental clamor. End what? What has already begun? The pressure intensified, forcing me to my knees. They were not merely performing a ritual, they were offering themselves. The ritual was not to bring it forth, but to transfer it, to ensure its continued existence by passing it from one vessel to the next, generation after generation. The inheritance was not just the house, but the burden, the curse. My lineage was not one of victims, but of willing participants, of custodians for this monstrosity. You are the next link, Cole, the final vessel. I saw myself, but not myself, standing at this altar, my eyes black, my mouth stretched in a silent scream. It was my ancestor, the one who had finally succumbed, whose essence had been consumed to fuel this thing. And it was waiting for me to join him. A primal scream tore from my throat, not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated defiance. I would not be another link in their chain of horrors. The key in my hand burned, its green light flaring, and I realized its true purpose. It wasn't merely a key to a lock. It was a conduit, a focal point. I jammed the key deeper into the altar's indentation, twisting it with all my might. The stone grated, a terrible shriek echoing through the chamber. The entity recoiled, its invisible presence momentarily lessening. This was the source of its power, the anchor of its existence. And the key, I now understood, was meant to either bind it or break it. The chamber began to tremble, dust raining down from the ceiling. The entity shrieked again, a sound that tore at the fabric of my mind, a scream of pure ancient rage and pain. It lunged, an unseen force slamming into me, sending me sprawling against the rough stone floor. My head cracked against the rock, and a wave of nausea washed over me, blurring my vision. I tasted blood, metallic and hot, filling my mouth, but I refused to yield. The key was still there, embedded in the stone. If it could be twisted, it could be untwisted. If it could bind, it could unbind. The entity's presence surged, a suffocating wave of malevolence. It sought to flood my mind, to shatter my will, to consume me whole. I felt its tendrils probing, searching for weakness, for a crack in my resolve. A memory of the sunlight on the mansion's overgrown gardens, a fleeting thought of the life I'd hoped to build there. It was small, fragile, but it was mine. And it was enough. With a roar that ripped my throat raw, I lunged back towards the altar, my hand reaching for the key. The entity fought back, throwing me against the wall, its unseen force a brutal, relentless battering ram. My ribs screamed, my head spun. But I saw the key, glinting, a defiant spark in the swirling green. My fingers closed around its cool iron, and with a desperate final surge of strength, I twisted. The chamber convulsed. A deafening crack echoed, and the green light flared, blindingly bright, then sputtered. The crushing weight on my chest vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. The entity's presence was still there, but diminished, wounded, raging. And I, Cole, stood before it, bruised and broken, but not yet its vessel. The iron key, once a vibrant pulse in my palm, now lay inert, a cold, heavy weight. My vision, once blurred by the swirling, malevolent haze that had choked this concrete cavern, slowly sharpened. The sickly, green luminescence that had pulsed from the very air had receded, leaving behind only the stark, indifferent glow of overhead fluorescent tubes, half obscured by the persistent mist. Jagged fissures spiderwebbed across the floor where I stood, radiating from a central point that was now nothing more than a shallow, blackened depression. Pillars bore deep gouges, as if clawed by something immense and desperate, and the low ceiling above sagged in places, weeping fine dust onto the damp ground. The lingering scent was not merely that of damp concrete and exhaust fumes, but something sharper, metallic, and acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike, mingled with a faint, cloying sweetness that made the back of my throat clench. Every muscle protested, a deep, bruising agony that went beyond mere exhaustion. I pushed myself upright, a tremor running through my legs, and leaned heavily against a stained pillar, the rough concrete scraping against my cheek. My hand, still clutching the now-dead key, felt alien, the skin stretched taut over knuckles that had been bruised and battered. I remembered the surge of power, raw and untamed, that had coursed through the key, through me, a desperate gambit against an ancient hunger. The entity had shrieked, a sound that had torn through the air, not with a physical voice, but with the raw agony of something immense being ripped from its moorings. It had been a retreat, a violent expulsion, rather than a vanquishing. My breath hitched, a phantom chill crawling up my spine, a whisper in the hollow spaces of my mind that echoed with the entity's lingering essence. It was not gone. I knew it with a certainty that settled like ice in my gut. It was merely dormant. A wounded beast retreating to lick its wounds, to gather its strength once more. A profound weariness settled over me, heavier than any physical burden. The world felt sharper, yet simultaneously more distant, as if a veil had been torn, revealing a layer of reality I was never meant to perceive. I had survived, yes, but not unscathed. The confrontation had not just been with an external force. It had been an internal fracturing, a forced evolution. This was the unsettling truth that began to unfurl within me. A slow, creeping realization. Some evils are not vanquished. They are merely contained, pushed back, or perhaps merely change their form. The entity had been tied to my lineage, to the very stones of the estate, and I, in confronting it, had become intertwined. I was no longer merely Cole, the inheritor, the accidental victim. I was now a part of the tapestry, a vessel that had held, however briefly, a fragment of its raw power and had paid the price. I stood amidst the wreckage, a solitary figure in a landscape of unseen devastation, feeling the profound shift within my own being. The fight was over for now, but the war had merely revealed its true, terrifying nature. It was not a war that could be won with a single blow, but a persistent, insidious struggle against an enemy that transcended time and space, an enemy that had found its anchor in my blood, in my very soul. I stood there, a statue carved from exhaustion and a terror that had hollowed me out, leaving only a reverberating echo where my core once resided. Slowly, deliberately, I turned, my neck stiff, my muscles screaming in protest. Each step I took was a conscious act of will, a battle against the inertia that threatened to root me to the spot. I imagined eyes in its swirling tendrils, watching my retreat, perhaps even following. Outside, the world was a blurred canvas of dawn, muted grays and bruised purples painting the sky. The crisp morning air, though still cool, felt like a balm after the garage's icy embrace. I walked, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to put distance between myself and that subterranean tomb. I had faced it, wrestled with it, and emerged. Different. Days bled into weeks, a hazy progression of forced normalcy. I returned to the house, not out of desire, but out of a perverse sense of obligation. It stood there, a brooding monolith against the sky, its windows like vacant eyes. I tried to clean, to dust away the layers of neglect, but every surface felt imbued with memory. Now they felt less like clues and more like warnings etched in ink. The names, the dates, the cryptic symbols. They spoke of a pact, of a guardianship passed down through generations. My ancestors hadn't merely performed a ritual, they had established a tether, a conduit. And I, Cole, had become its latest anchor. The realization settled upon me like a cold stone in my chest. The entity hadn't been vanquished. It had merely been contained. And its containment, its very existence, was now inextricably linked to me. The creaks and groans of the old timbers, once phantom footsteps, now seemed like the house breathing, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched my own. It was a symbiotic relationship, born of fear and necessity. My decision came, not in a flash of insight, but through a slow, creeping certainty. To leave would be to sever a connection that now felt essential. The entity, the truth of my lineage, was not a curse to be escaped, but a burden to be carried, a legacy to be managed. I was not its victim. I was its new guardian. I started to organize the house, not as a desperate attempt to erase its past, but to integrate it into my present. I repaired a broken pane in the sunroom, polished the tarnished silver in the dining room, and even tended to the overgrown garden. Each act was a silent affirmation of my new role. The evenings were the hardest. I would sit by the dying embers in the hearth, a heavy tome open on my lap, though my eyes rarely focused on the words. I would listen. I no longer screamed, no longer ran. I merely acknowledged it, a silent communion with the unseen. The fear had not vanished. It had simply transformed. I was a vessel, yes, but also a warden. The cycle of fear, the generations-old ritual, had found its latest iteration. I was Cole, and I was home. The house waited, breathing, and I, its silent keeper, waited with it, for whatever the long, unending night might bring.